All right, I'm going to go ahead and pray for us, and we'll dive in. It's an 8-page chapter, so little bit longer than last week. And again, I'm going to be pretty much reading through it and commenting as we go along. This book, like a lot of books, takes a while to just introduce everything, and then it gets into the nitty-gritty. So be patient. The whole book isn't all as academic as the first section, and it starts to get a little bit more practical in how to deal with atheists as we go along. So let me pray for us, and we'll dive in. Father, thank you for all the ladies that are together in Santa Cruz right now, and I think their final session is this morning. And I thank you. I'm hearing good reports of the speaker and the fellowship and the time they're having together. So we pray that you'd bring them back safely. And thank you for the time that they've been having together. Lord, as we talk about atheism this morning, and then later today talk about you as our Father, two total opposites, where people don't believe in you at all, to what are you like, and how have you revealed yourself, as we're looking at the Trinity over these next few weeks. So Lord, I just pray that as believers we would continue to get to know you better and become more intimate with you as we learn about you. And for those we know who don't want to believe in you or have suppressed the truth because they want to live in sin, or both, we just ask you to give us wisdom to know how to share the gospel with them and talk about you in a way that they'd want to hear it and come to know Jesus as the Lord and Savior. In Jesus' name, amen. Am I hearing music? Oh, it's you. I go, where's that coming from? I go, I feel like I'm riding an elevator or something, you know? I'm glad it's not just me. I don't know of any good insane asylums around us. So. All right. Okay, so if there's a God, why are there atheists? We're in the second chapter, and the title of this chapter is The Tension of Disagreement. Last week we looked on, the title was The Great Debate, and we, just by way of summary or review, we looked at several different beliefs in relationship to God. And so you have, for atheism, what would you say, when you think about an atheist, what do you think they believe about God? You know, if you just think about an atheist, generally an atheist, what are they saying about God?
That there is no God.
Yeah, there is no God. So they're affirmatively denying the reality and the existence of God. And that's
need God, a God.
Yeah, yeah. And again, the psychology of that, the background, what they've been exposed to, whatever, it's going to vary per atheist. You have some atheists that are very angry, but you have some atheists that are nice people. They're very nice and do good things, and so there's a variety of atheists. But again, what they would all agree on is that there's not enough evidence, they would say, for them to be convinced that there's a God. Okay, how about agnostics? When you look at agnostics, how is an agnostic different than an atheist?
Well, they just have the question mark in their mind.
Yeah, so they're not dogmatic
They don't know.
about it. Well, some of them are a little bit more dogmatic than others, but they tend to lean towards somewhere in the middle where maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I think there's insufficient evidence for me to believe that there's a God, okay? So they're not blatantly, there is no God, and they're not blatantly, there is a God. They're somewhere in the middle of those two poles.
It's not worth my time to try to figure it out.
Yeah, it's just, again, there's different kinds of agnostics. But again, I honestly think that as I know people that identify agnostics, and some are very close to me, they they have more important things on their radar. It's like if he's there, it's not very clear to me that he is there, but if he's there, I'll get to him someday if he is. I've got work to do, I've got fun to have, and so forth.
If he's there, he's not the God of the Bible.
Yeah, you certainly don't want the God of the Bible to be the one that exists.
Tries to be God. Do you think they both try to?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think they both do.
Like making AI and.
Yeah. I think anybody who doesn't worship God, ultimately, you're worshiping yourself, no matter what you say.
Yeah.
And you're the arbiter. You become the arbiter of truth. Because what authority is there, other than you, in some sense. Other than laws and those kinds of things that you can't do a lot about. Then we talked about polytheists, and polytheists are what? What do they believe?
Many gods.
Yeah, there are many gods, multiple gods. Hindus, for instance, Hindus are a really good example of people that believe in lots of gods. Mormons are polytheists, as well. So the polytheists. Then we talked about henotheism, and that may have been something new to you, but what is a henotheist?
What does heno mean?
So a henotheist, especially in the Old Testament, during when Israel Israel was dealing with the Philistines and all these different groups of people, and all these different groups of people had a god of typically their nation. That basically was the God of the boundaries in which they lived, of their nation, of their government, and so forth. And so at the time, when most of the Old Testament was written, there were many, whoever Israel was warring with, usually we have Yahweh and you have your God. And they were fighting for their God. And probably one of the biggest example of that is the Philistines, and David challenging Goliath and saying, "How dare you come at me in the name of your God?" Elijah with the prophets of Baal. So Baal were the ones that Elijah was dealing with, where you're dealing with a people that worship a totally different God than you, and so again, they believe there's more than one God, so they're polytheist, but specifically they're henotheist because they believe in a regional, national God. Now, you don't see that as much today, but it does exist. Again, I would say that all Muslims, in a sense, are henotheists because they believe in a national God, but they're monotheists because they only believe there's one God. So they don't believe in more than one God, but they do believe that their God is different than, for instance, our God. They don't believe in the triune God that we believe in. That's a false God to them. But again, they're not technically henotheists. They are monotheists. However, they're whatever nation that Islam establishes it for the purposes of serving Allah, who they believe is the only God. Okay, so anyway, that's sort of what we covered last week, is just sort of the different views of people who are theists and the different kinds of theism that exists. And then today we're going to look at what he calls the tension of disagreement. And so follow along as I begin chapter 2 of If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? By the way, these books are still on back order. We may end up just canceling because it's like they probably won't even come till March at this point, and we're going to be almost done in March. So I'll try and provide as much material for you from each chapter as I can. So far I've been able to give you everything, so you have it. You can get them individually if you want. Yeah, you can just order them individually on Amazon, but for whatever reason, a group order is not coming forth anytime soon. All right, so we have seen that the issue of the existence of God has not been settled once and for all in Western civilization. Great minds have taken opposing positions with reference to this question. Impressive arguments have come forth from the side of atheism and the side of theism. The disagreement has not left all men in a state of dispassionate lack of concern. Rather, The debate continues, often with militant rhetoric. Some have sought to circumvent the heat of the controversy by seeking a third alternative, which would give us at least a guarded truce. The third alternative that has captured the imagination of many Westerners is the alternative of seeing the question of the existence of God as a subjective, practical question rather than an objective, metaphysical question. So thus, the question is dealt with on the basis of a subjective evaluation of faith or its denial. In concrete terms, a person may look at it this way. I believe in God, and my faith in God is meaningful to my life. It brings me comfort, it provides a goal and purpose for my life. It offers hope to me that the universe is ultimately meaningful. And because the whole of existence is ultimately meaningful, my individual life is meaningful. On the other hand, a person may say, I do not believe in God, and I found it quite meaningful to live without such faith. So for me, and for my life, there is no God. It is a short step for these two persons to avoid the controversy of their different conclusions by saying that for the one who finds faith meaningful, God is true, and for the one who finds unbelief meaningful, God is not true. So let me just stop there for a second. And again, this reminds me of what Francis Schaeffer does in his writing, where he has titles of books like There is a God and He is Not Silent, The God Who Is There. And what Schaeffer was getting at with a lot of his writings was the subjective aspects of God really are meaningless unless objectively he either exists or he doesn't exist. So somebody's living is meaningless.
Right.
Actually everybody's, if he doesn't exist, everybody's living is meaningless ultimately, because we just live and die and that's it. Right. And soon to be forgotten. But if God does exist, then our meaning derives from this existence that He has objectively. And it's not just objectively true for us. If He exists, even if you don't want Him to exist, and He exists, He still exists whether you like it or not. So in other words, our subjectivism is neither here nor there with reference to what's objectively true, with reference to reality. So again, even though this is as he talks about, it's a third way, and I would guess that this is probably the majority of people in America think this way. Our relativism, is such that, hey, if you want to believe there's a God and it works for you, that's fine, but don't push it on me, don't, by all means, don't, I don't want to hear about it. If that's what you want to do in your closet and on your Sundays and so forth, but don't bug me about it, But again, the ramifications for that person, if God exists, are huge. So again, this really doesn't do anything about the issue. And the issue is there a God or isn't there a God? So whether you privatize that or not, the reality is if God really exists, then that means something for all of us. So I've drawn on this board many times, the two-story house. And what Schaeffer talks about is that secularism has put God, and what they want to do is they want to privatize anything to do with religion in the top story and say that this isn't relevant to the first story. And the first story is all that should be dealt with in community and nationally and so forth. So if you want to believe, if you want to go to your second story and you want to pray to God and stuff like that, that's fine. But don't make us pray to God in the first story. Don't talk about God. We don't want to hear about the Ten Commandments. We don't want to hear about Jesus. Keep that to yourself. So in our culture, and this started really in Europe during World War I, there was this, what happened was there was a lot of people who were going to church, they're praying, their sons are called to war and they're killed, and all of a sudden you got a lot of people who are angry with God and wondering, if there is a God, how in the world can he allow this? And if he's all powerful and he can't stop this, then he's not much of a God. And so what you had is you had a fallout, like a massive fallout between World War I and World War II. And then ever since then, in Europe, it went from 80% to 90% church attendance to now it's probably less than 3% church attendance. And we have followed in America. Not to the same extent, but when you go to colleges and universities and public schools and wherever, they've done a fine job of getting God out of the first story in society and in education and what have you. He's been moved up to the top floor. Hopefully he stays there and don't let him out. And that's so subjectively, honestly, we do live in a very pragmatically atheistic culture.
Yeah.
Okay. So he continues and he says, here the question of the existence of God is reduced to a question of practical meaningfulness in the life of individuals. Excuse me, if truth is defined as that which is meaningful to the one who believes, then of course anything that is meaningful to the individual may be regarded as true. Also, anything that is not meaningful to the individual may be regarded as false. This approach to the question of the existence of God does not solve the tension of disagreement. It does serve to soften the emotional hostility that often surrounds the debate. It does much to bring us peace, but very little to bring us truth. The issue of the objective existence of God still remains. So the question of God's existence is a different question from the question of what man finds meaningful and practical. By taking this third alternative, we can discover many answers to the questions of practical meaningfulness, whatever that much abused word meaning may actually point to. But we will not find an answer to the question of the existence of God. For example, if I believe in God with all my heart and with all my mind and find that belief so meaningful that I devote my life to serving this God, if I pray to this God, if I worship this God, if I sacrifice my life to this God, and in fact there is no such God, all my praying and devotion and sacrifice will not bring him into existence. That is, if I find all kinds of personal meaning by believing in God, that meaningfulness will not cause God to be, if in fact there is no such God. On the other hand, if I do not believe in God and am convinced that God is the invention of superstitious minds, bringing to mind Elvis's song, we can't go on living with suspicious minds. Oh no, that's superstitious. Okay, anyway, suspicious minds, sorry. And is irrelevant to my existence. If I find my meaning in life without reference to God, and in fact there is a God, then all my unbelief and disinterest will not change that fact. In the final analysis, there either is a God or gods, or there are none. There either is something or someone ultimate apart from me, or there is not. So not only can the question of the objective existence of God not be decided by personal meaningfulness of the individual, but the question can also not be decided by a collective discovery of subjective meaningfulness of the God hypothesis. That is to say, my individual lack of belief of it cannot decide the ultimate question of the existence of God, nor can a number of individual beliefs decide the ultimate issue. Simply stated, the truth is not determined by counting noses. Such a democratic approach to truth wherein the majority wins can only be descriptive of what the many believe rather than what actually is. If 99% of the people of the world believe in God, that does not mean there is a God. Conversely, if 99% of the world believes there is no God, that in itself does not decide the issue. Our culture places much emphasis on democracy and on public opinion polls, but they have little to say in regards to ultimate truth. 10,000 people on the street can be wrong, and I may add often are wrong. Okay, so then he talks about the law of contradiction. And this is a very important law for you to understand, for all of us to understand, when we're dealing with anybody in evangelism or apologetics. And the reason is because people oftentimes have thinking that is contradictory. And it's important that we're good at showing them that. And it's easy to do when you know objective truth. So, for instance, if I'm a math professor and you're in my class, you're going to go very wrong if you do not believe in the foundations of general math. Okay, so in general math, if you say that 1 + 1 = 3, and you continue in that vein for the rest of your mathematical career, you're not going to go very far. As a matter of fact, you're going to flunk every single math class you take. Why? Because in terms of math, everything in math is based on objective truth. Now, there's theoretical mathematics, of course, but I'm talking most of the math that most students are trained in involves a building on a foundation of objective truth, something we all agree on. It would never work. If this is a math class and, John, you want to believe 1 + 1 = 4, that's fine for you. That's great. Okay, God bless you. Chuck, 1 + 1 = 0. Okay, fine. Go for it. Karen, and we all just believe whatever we want about it. That math class is going to be an absolute disaster. And I certainly don't want you being a part of our nuclear team for a war.
Really?
Where it's like, it doesn't matter what the formula is. Just push the button. Who cares what's in the formula? If you want to believe it's, has this component, then great. But if you want to believe, we don't run anything like that. Okay? But why is it that when we get to the absolute most important questions of life, where did we come from? Why are we here? Is there a meaning to life? Where are we going? That we can be just neutral on this and subjective. Okay, it's sheer. Honestly, it's very foolish to think this way. But this is the way that PhDs in physics and biology and all kinds of things think. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you're talking about the math, my son-in-law is a public high school math teacher in LA County. Mm-hmm. And
he needs prayer.
Yeah, and I was there. I was there when he got a list of papers. And if a student has a problem, and it's clearly like 2 + 2, if they don't have 4 for the answer, then he cannot say that you're wrong.
What?
He has to say, and they gave him, how did you arrive at that answer?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. That's sheer nonsense. Yeah. And I wouldn't last 5 seconds in his position. God bless him that he sticks with it. But I couldn't do it. I don't have the
all their kids are homeschooled.
Yeah. Well, that tells you everything you need to know right there. Okay, so the law of contradiction. So let's get into it. In the objective realm of the question of the existence of God, both sides cannot be right. There cannot be a God or gods on the one hand, and at the same time be no gods. To avoid the pain of disagreement by affirming both poles is to violate the law of contradiction. The law of contradiction is that A cannot be A and non-A at the same time. That is to say, there cannot be a God and no God at the same time. To say that God is and is not is to speak nonsense. To be sure, the 20th century has shown a tendency to be nonsensical, to ignore the law of contradiction as a necessary principle for a coherent discourse. In reaction against previous forms of rationalism, many contemporary thinkers, particularly of the existentialist school, have maintained that truth indeed may be contradictory. That is, truth rises above logical categories and cannot be restricted by the law of contradiction. Now, I don't know if R.C. addresses this here, I can't remember, but R.C. talks about, he once had a professor stand up in front of the class, a philosophy professor, and say that contradiction is the hallmark of truth. And everybody in the class said, we're just like, wow, that's profound. You know? And RC's like,
Wow.
you know, he's thinking to himself, that's the most foolish statement I've ever heard in my life.
Right.
Okay? Because in saying that contradiction is the hallmark of truth, if a contradiction is something that can be false and true at the same time,
Then it's not true.
yeah, so no matter how you slice that, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
But here you have a philosophy professor who contradiction is the hallmark of truth. And everybody just goes, hey, I want an A in this class, so if he says that, he's smarter than me, he's got a PhD, I'm going with it. But this is the kind of sheer nonsense that we see in our culture. So in reaction to this, thinkers have continued to operate using the law of contradiction, have been charged with perpetuating Aristotle's system of truth, which can no longer function in modern thought. Now, by the way, this has gotten into everything, okay? Not just philosophy and theology. That's why people can be on national television and national politics and say, a guy can identify as a girl. This is the law of This is the law of contradiction at work, okay? To its, that's where things go. It's just sheer nonsense and sheer falsity. And then it's pushed on you. And you're the person that's evil for not allowing this thing to take place. But again, we see this all over the place, left and right. So it should be emphatically clear that adherence to the law of contradiction does not presuppose a blind acceptance of the entire system of Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle did not invent logic, nor was the law of contradiction the conclusion of his system. For Aristotle, logic was defined, not invented. He described logic as being the organon of all science, that should probably be origin, of all science and truth-seeking. That is, logic was viewed as a necessary instrument or tool by which knowledge could be coherently expressed and understood. Statements that violated the law of contradiction were judged by Aristotle to be nonsense statements, to be meaningless with respect to content. So though in the 20th century we have seen a rejection of the law of contradiction at the theoretical level, we have seen at the same time a virtual universal acceptance of the law of contradiction at the practical level. Though people deny the validity of the law of contradiction intellectually, they all live their daily lives with the assumption that the law is valid. The philosopher who denies the validity of the law of contradiction in his study still adopts the law when he drives his car through an intersection of a highway. When he sees a truck speeding toward the point of the intersection where he wishes to proceed, he stops his car because he knows that if there's a truck in front of him, there cannot at the same time not be a truck in front of him. As he thinks his theory of non-contradiction, he applies the brakes to his car. If a doctor found conclusive evidence for the presence of a malignant cancer in the body of one of his patients and reasoned within himself that there was also no cancer in his patient's body and treated the patient on the basis of that possibility, his treatment would be regarded as nothing less than criminal. Man cannot survive without assuming the validity of the law of contradiction. So in the intellectual community, there's often a fascination with statements that are blatant violations of the law of contradiction. At first impact, such statements from supposedly intelligent professors often carry the aura of profundity and produce a sense of awe in the bewildered student. For example, I once witnessed a well-known theologian making this statement to his students. God is absolutely immutable in his essence, and God is absolutely mutable in his essence. Okay, so if the first statement, God is absolutely immutable in his essence, what does that mean?
Doesn't change.
Yeah, he cannot change his essence, his being.
Right.
Okay, we've been looking at this in our study of the Trinity. This last week we talked about what's the difference between essence or being and person. So what we said is that God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit are all one in essence, okay? Cannot change in their essence. However, they're distinct in person. Okay, that's not a contradiction. If we said God is one in essence and God is three in essence, that would be contradictory. We're saying he's one and three. You can't, how can he be one and three in one thing? You can't. Okay, so this statement here is an absolute violation of the law of contradiction, because it's saying God is absolutely, again, that term in and of itself, absolutely means that it would be, it's impossible that he's anything other than immutable in his essence. But God is absolutely immutable in his essence. Okay, that is an absolute. I mean, the fact that every single student in that classroom didn't say, "Professor, what have you been smoking?" Okay. No, I mean, that is an absolute contradictory statement. So at the end of this contradictory statement, the professor paused to allow his words to sink in, and the reaction of the students was almost reverent. They were filled with awe at the profundity of the professor's statement. When I queried some of the students about what they learned from such a statement, they admitted that they had learned nothing, but that the professor's statement was certainly deep and penetrating. One student remarked, "I cannot understand what the professor is saying. It is too deep for me. But I am sure the professor must understand it because he is so much more brilliant than I am." So a further example may be drawn from my own experience as a professor of philosophy. On one occasion, I stood before my class and held up a piece of chalk in my hand, and I said to the class, which included on that particular afternoon the dean of the school as he sat in to audit my class, "This piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk." I made the statement in a tone and voice that was somewhat hushed and awe-inspiring. The kind of voice a professor might use when he's trying to communicate something deep. I screwed up my face to make myself appear contemplative and pensive. After the statement, I asked the students, "What did you learn from that statement?" After some careful consideration, one student answered by saying, "That piece of chalk is not really a piece of chalk." I responded, "What piece of chalk?" And the student said, "That piece of chalk." I said, "But this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk, so why do you call it a piece of chalk?" At this point, the student became befuddled, and the atmosphere of confusion permeated the room. After a period of silent contemplation, the dean became involved in the inquiry by stating, "I have learned that that particular piece of chalk that you have in your hand is not a piece of chalk." And I said, "Which particular piece of chalk?" And he indicated that the piece of chalk I had in my hand. And I replied, "I told you, this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. Why do you insist on calling it a piece of chalk?" Finally, after much frustration that was moving toward the level of annoyance, a black urban pastor could stand the intellectual nonsense no longer. He boldly declared, "Man, I ain't learned nothing." Needless to say, I was relieved to discover that there was at least one thinking creature left in the room. In some circumstances, the bold declaration and profession of both sides of a contradiction may sound clever or profound, but upon closer scrutiny, the contradiction seems merely absurd. The law of contradiction is not a system of truth. It is not a self-contained philosophy. It is not even a theory of knowledge. It is simply what Aristotle called it, an instrument of meaningful discourse, an instrument necessary for verbal communication to be understood. The law of contradiction cannot, in and of itself, prove the existence of God, nor, of course, could it disprove the existence of God. The service rendered to us at this point by the law of contradiction is simply this. It demonstrates to us that we cannot solve the tension of a disagreement by affirming both poles. One side must be wrong. Both sides cannot be right. Much as we moderns want to have it both ways in the name of freedom and tolerance, it cannot be done. A flight into non-rationality only adds to the dilemma of the classical issue. The disagreement remains, and we move then to the question of why the disagreement remains. How is it possible for men of equal brilliance, of equal intellectual prowess, of equal educational backgrounds and sophistication to arrive at two mutually exclusive conclusions? Okay, so any comments before we move on?
I was trying to share with my brother-in-law who has 3 kids. 2 of them are gay. And we have 2 transsexual grandkids. And so I invited his kids over for Thanksgiving. And he said, "Oh, wow, really? That's great." He said, "Well, I thought you guys were kind of against." I said, "Hey, listen, my granddaughters have gone further in sin than your kids." And he chuckled at me because my grandkids are transsexual. So they're even further into the mire than you guys. And he kind of laughed at that, but that kind of ended it. Because of course, again, I get too passionate instead of trying to find that one thing that we can agree on and then go from there.
Right.
It's a bummer.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think that's one of the problems with me in trying to find a mutual place where we can launch. Because I can see how the one who does not believe in God
Right.
lives their life.
Right.
Because I could easily do that, except that I know that God is, and I see it because of knowing that that all of the things he predicted have transpired and will continue to do so. So that is my clear evidence. But I can't relay that to my brother-in-law because he's not there. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
twisting and twisting.
Yeah, it's sort of like playing a board game, and you have a set of rules for the game,
Yeah.
and they have another set of rules,
Yeah.
and you can't do. You have to have the same.
Meaningless.
You have to have the same set of rules. You have to abide by the same rules, and that's why it is very complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you hear this often these days where people will say, well, that's your truth,
Yeah.
and that's my truth,
Right.
even in a non-religious context.
Yeah.
It's kind of, people are so profoundly uncomfortable with saying I'm right and you're wrong and this is the way it is. It's kind of the glue that holds society together, especially
Yeah.
with multiculturalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've got 5 different things, atheist, Christian, this, that,
Yeah.
you kind of have to have, for society to function, everybody has to be cool with everybody to some degree,
Uh-huh.
which means your society won't even work if everyone's going around saying, this is the thing I believe in is an objective truth that really is immutable.
Right. And again, all we can do is give evidence that points to objective reality, starting with what we agree on. So even if somebody says to me, well, that's your truth, I immediately think, if this person's an adult, they drive. And like you said, when you come to a stop sign, I don't assume that I have a different view of the stop sign than everybody else. Okay, I assume that if you're driving, you've studied the laws of the land, at least the more important ones, the more basic, obvious ones. And so you have the same view of that stop sign that I do, and that's what makes the road safe.
Yeah.
But then I go to the next point, and that is, do you agree that there is objective truth because there are driving laws for everybody that drives, for everybody that has a driver's license, that we agree on the same laws?
Right.
And if we don't, what would that mean? Okay, that's very clear. I mean, you have to be really a nut to not follow that line, okay? So almost anybody, even a liberal, insane person, that votes for weasels to, run the government is going to agree on that, I hope. So we'll agree on that. So what you do is you build your case on different things that we both agree are objectively true. But at some point, you have to jump to the fact that, okay, here we are. We're two intelligent people that are having a conversation. And we may disagree even on how are we able to understand each other and communicate to each other. And I happen to believe that there's a soulish element to me that is non-material, that is interacting with you right now. Now, if you say you don't believe in a God, how do you explain the immaterial part of you that's speaking to me and understanding me right now? Again, what you do is you continue to just throw at them things that they have no answers for. And what it does is it shows them the absurdity of their reasoning. To make the statement that what's true for you is not true for me, they have to ultimately see as a contradiction.
Right.
Because if it's true for me, it's also true for you.
Yes.
In other words, the only things that are true are objectively true.
Well, what's happened, as you know, is that they've demoted God to a belief system. So I believe in man-made climate change. You don't believe in man-made climate change. So who's right and who's wrong? Well, that's your belief. This is my belief. So once you demote God to that level as a personal, internalized belief, then this is where the troubles begin, it seems to me.
Yeah. But again, I just think that with anybody that disagrees with you on anything, if you know that what they believe is not objectively true, you have the higher ground.
Right.
It's easy for you.
Yeah.
Because you have evidence. Okay, because there's nothing we believe in, or at least we shouldn't, that doesn't have evidence to back it up. Okay, like I've never seen anybody raised from the dead, but I still believe that Jesus rose from the dead. On what basis? Well, there's a lot of facts that go with it. And the reality is the explanation of the resurrection without the way it actually happened is virtually impossible to do. It's completely nonsensical in any other way to explain it. So what I'm dealing with at that point ultimately is this person that I'm talking to is basically saying, I cannot believe in the supernatural. And if they tell me that, and they have, then I say, yes, you do. Because you believe you're here by chance. No, I don't. I believe I evolved. Well, okay, so if you go back as far as you can, how do you explain that? And where did that come from? And ultimately, they have to admit that what they believe is by faith. And they have to acknowledge something supernatural. Again, because material things are simply in a state of decay. Everything that's material is in a state of decay. Everything. There's nothing material that is advancing unless an outside force is helping it advance. Okay, the wall is getting painted. The electrical outlet that's out is being replaced or being fixed. Everything that's material is in a state of decay. So you're telling me that here we are advancing left and right. We're advancing in all these ways by chance? And what is chance? And see, I never let anybody get away. I never let them get away. Unless they hit me and knock me out or something. That hasn't happened yet, but it probably will someday. But I never let anybody get away with a statement that's untrue without challenging it. Mm-hmm. And again, it's easy. Because if you know what's objectively true, and you have evidence for it, and you can give multiple evidences for why you believe what you believe. See, they can't ultimately, because what they have to ultimately go back to takes an amazing amount of faith. I don't have that kind of faith. So don't let them get away with saying that's your truth. if it's true for me, now, there are exceptions to this. Like, for instance, I love my wife. You may not love my wife. Okay, so that's true for me. It's not true for you.
I think people conflate that, because
Yeah.
I could say, oh, this book, the print's too small for me to
Yeah.
read.
Yeah.
Someone else would say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's fine, easy.
But see, but when it comes to like climate change is either, it has to either be real or not real.
Yes.
Okay, so that's something that it involves objective truth for everybody.
True.
Okay, so there are things I would say that are subjective, but again, when we're talking about matters of pretty big importance, like the existence of God, which is arguably the most important matter, the point is he can't. If I want him to exist and he doesn't, then as Paul said, people should pity me. I'm living for something that doesn't even matter. I'm living for something that doesn't even exist. And Paul was right. If that is the case, then we're the most to be pitied. But if it's true, then the person we're talking to who denies it, if it indeed is real, needs to be pitied. But you can't, somebody needs to be pitied, because you can't both be right on there being a God and not being a God at the same time in the same relationship.
There are so many things that stand out to prove that the manuscripts are true. You follow the Jewish people, that does it right there. There's unlimited artifacts, history, and so on, to prove there is a God, their God.
And this is why there are people like C.S. Lewis and Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace and others. And they're good people to turn atheists and agnostics onto, because they took the time to investigate, is there good evidence for why you believe this? Yeah. Again, a smart person says, hey, there either is a God or there isn't a God. But if there is, and I don't investigate any evidence for that, that's pretty foolish, because the ramifications, if there is a God and I don't believe in him, are pretty bad for me. Okay? And that's why I tell people, man, if you're going to check out anything, I do the same thing when I go to the doctor anymore. I don't like going to the doctor because I don't trust doctors. Okay? I don't know how many doctors are in it for the money and how many are in it because they really like helping people. But if they're in it for the money and they get a cut on whatever drugs they're recommending me to take to be to be on for the rest of my life, and basically it's because they could put that down payment on that Ferrari they want. And the reality is, I don't know. I don't know if what they're saying is true or not. I don't know if that's what I need or not. So it behooves me to do research and check it out. And I think people are foolish to just because somebody's a doctor, just because somebody's a pastor, just because somebody's a dentist or a whatever they are, a politician. Do we just say, oh, Gavin Newsom's a politician, so I'm going to believe everything he says? Well, I sure hope not.
Right.
Okay. We need to do due diligence and research to go, is what they're saying objectively true? Is that where our taxes are really going? Is this money being spent as they say? And when you follow a lot of things and you follow the money, you find out that they're lying left and right. Okay? So this is happening all the time, and it's not just pastors, it's not just theologians, it's not just teachers and so forth. I think it behooves us, especially on the big questions in life, to take matters into our own hands and go, what's the evidence here? Right. And I think you're right. I think the evidence for Christianity is absolutely incredibly compelling and overwhelming. And anybody who takes the time to investigate it with an open mind will typically find, wow, there's, these people aren't, I thought they were idiots, but they're not. They're actually pretty intelligent people who have good reasons to believe what they believe. See, I do the same thing with atheists. There's a lot of smart atheists. Okay, Richard Dawkins is a smart guy. He knows way more about science than I ever will. But in terms of him making fun of anybody who believes in God as equivalent to like a tooth fairy or something like that. I just think that's very sophomoric in really examining the evidence. And basically what they do is they just say, there can't be a God. That's ridiculous. For anybody to even believe in that is just archaic and it's just stupid. Well, I don't think if you investigate the evidence, I think if you investigate the evidence, I think you're foolish to believe there's no God.
Yeah.
Because what you're putting your faith in, and you are, to me, is incredibly foolish, and I just don't see as much evidence for you to believe there is no God as there is evidence to believe there is a God. But again, you're entitled to that. I'm not going to kill him for it. I'm not going to hate him for it. I pity him. And I hope that he repents, like Antony Flew did before he died, as we talked about last week. But ultimately, the issue is there a God or isn't there a God? And it behooves us to at least investigate the evidence on such an important question. Yeah. Okay, let's go through the rest of this real quick. I want to get through it. Reasons for disagreement about objective truth. When experts disagree and come to mutually, I think I already read that. So experts, of course, are capable of making mistakes. The greatest minds are subject to error. There are innumerable ways in which errors are made in the process of rational debate. A considerable number of factors may be involved that will lead to error. For purposes of simplification, we're going to list 4 basic kinds of errors that are frequently made in the greatest or by the greatest of men. So here are the 4 errors that are commonly made. Epistemological errors, and again, we're going to define all these. Epistemological errors, formal errors in reasoning, factual errors in empirical investigation, and psychological prejudice that distorts conclusions. So first of all, epistemological errors. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy that deals specifically with the question of knowledge. It deals with the definition of truth and methods of attaining truth. There is no universally accepted epistemology by which experts operate. Historically, there have been many schools of epistemology, the most famous of which have been the schools of rationalism and empiricism. The various schools of rationalism have given great emphasis to the function of reasoning in order to arrive at truth. The accent has fallen upon the formal and theoretical rather than upon the material and the tangible. In extreme cases, some from the tradition of rationalism argued that whatever can be conceived as being true logically must exist in reality. We can call this school the conceptualist school. That which can be conceived by the mind in rational categories must exist in reality. The 17th century existentialists or essentialists were representative of this approach to truth. On the other hand, the empiricist school has sought to discover truth more through the examination of hard data, through what is perceived by the 5 senses, that through logical speculation. Here the rule is whatever is perceived by the senses is true. Whatever cannot be perceived by the senses is not true. 2 experts using these 2 vastly different approaches to knowledge could come to different conclusions regarding the existence of God. The conceptualists might argue that to conceive of God is perfectly proper within the context of rational speculation and does not pose immediate problems of irrationality and therefore must be regarded as being true. On the other hand, one who followed a very strict empirical course of epistemology would argue that a metaphysical being called God, who cannot be perceived by the senses, cannot be true because it cannot meet the test for truth, that of empirical verification. So we can see how true brilliant minds can come to different conclusions using 2 different epistemologies as their basis for investigation. Of course, it is important to remember that the 2 epistemologies mentioned above are by no means the only epistemologies vying for acceptance among scholars. Indeed, it would be very unlikely to find many philosophers in the 20th century who would take such a one-sided view of rationalism or such a one-sided view of empiricism as outlined above. The conclusion of the theist or the atheist may be largely conditioned by the validity or invalidity of the epistemology employed. And again, I've dealt with people that are strict empiricists, and there was a professor at Reed College in Oregon. Reed College is sort of considered like the Berkeley of the Northwest. And one of the professors there in the philosophy department, I would be outside with students regularly. Typically on Fridays, we'd wait for the philosophy classes to get out, and then we'd engage in discussion with philosophy students. He came out once and engaged in a conversation with us, and he had a piece of chalk. This was 35 years ago when you used chalk, like RC's talking about. But he had a piece of chalk, and he said, I'm going to show you right here and now that there is no God. And he said, if there is a God, he'll catch this piece of chalk. If there isn't a God, he won't. And he dropped the piece of chalk and it fell to the floor. And the students laughed and he laughed. But we didn't take it that seriously because, again, we're considering not just, we're not just considering empiricism, we're considering rational arguments for the existence of God. And it's not that one's right and the other's wrong. It's just there are two different categories of understanding things. But not everything, of course, can be derived at in an empirical sense, like love. Okay? I think all of us in this room would agree that love exists. But can you prove it? Okay? That would be challenging. Okay? Or at least, maybe I could show love in a certain, like John, I think, shows love by bringing us donuts, every week. That's a loving thing to do. I mean, he's not doing it because he hates us. I mean, if he hated us, he wouldn't be well, maybe he would. Maybe he'd just want us to die of diabetes, Maybe there's an ulterior motive. No. Yeah. But
You've been uncovered.
But I think most of us think that John brings donuts not because he wants to kill us, but because he loves us. I think most of us would agree with that. Could we prove it? Okay, that would be challenging.
I feel better when I eat a donut.
Okay, yeah. But again, it's like, some things are challenging depending on where you're throwing all your eggs in that basket. And that's why I think apologetics, even the way we do discipleship, like you've noticed, I hope you've noticed, that all of our questions fall in three categories: head, heart, and hands. Why am I doing that? Well, I'm doing it because I believe that the rational and the empirical are important. Mm-hmm. In other words, I could just focus on everything, could just be intellectual, and that would be very easy for me. I mean, I could talk about high intellectual stuff all day. I love it. And never get to the heart, never get to the hands, and it probably wouldn't even faze me that much. But I'd be a pretty out of balance person. Okay? And I'd be making a lot of unbalanced people. That's what the Gnostics did. For the Gnostics, it was this higher knowledge that they were after, and that's what they challenged when people weren't at that level and didn't believe the way they did. And so Gnostic religions tend to be very much of the head. They're very heady, intellectual, like Christian Science is that way. I think it's important that we get Augustine's dictum that all truth is God's truth. All truth. So it's not just what's true about theology, but what's true about science. It's not just true about what's true about science, but what's true about the body. What's true about love. What's true about hate. What's true about everything. And so everything has, if it corresponds to reality, must be objectively true. And if it's not objectively true, then there's only one other category that it falls into. It's objectively false. Where does subjectivism fall into that? Well, usually your subjectivism is based on either what's true or false as well, right? Like you can think that somebody loves you and find out that they don't.
Right.
So what was the reality in the first place?
They didn't love you.
They don't love you. You think they love you?
Yeah.
You're wrong. They don't love you. So, but you might have had some subjective feelings. You know, it's like, they got me donuts. But you didn't know that they were giving you donuts to give you diabetes and kill you. And again, we are not, and by no means saying that, John. Now John's not going to bring donuts. Next week he's going to go. That's it, man. No. The reality is.
Bring fewer.
And see, here's the thing: is John either loves us or he doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, he either cares about us or he doesn't. He brings donuts because he loves us or he doesn't. And again, there's an objective truth that motivates John to bring donuts. Regardless of what we think about the donuts.
Yeah.
There is an objective truth of why he's doing what he does. It's the same thing for me as a pastor. I mean, why do I do what I do? Okay, do I do it because of the amazing salary that I get to be able to live in Marin County? Oh yeah, I just want to tell you right away, absolutely not. It's difficult to live in Marin County. And it doesn't matter who you are. This is a tough place to live, no matter how much money you make. But that's not why I do what I do. That's not what motivates me. It's nowhere close. It's not even the top 50 probably of why I do what I do. But again, you don't know why I do what I do. You make observations, and these observations may be true, they may be not. But again, ultimately, why I do what I do, why you do what you do, ultimately why you do those things is based on what you believe to be true. Okay? But we experience your beliefs most of the time subjectively. Okay? And we are subjectively right or we're subjectively wrong in our evaluations and in our assessments. Okay, let me continue reading here. Did I finish epistemology?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, then formal errors. Formal errors, even if a philosopher uses a perfectly valid epistemology, that will be no guarantee that the conclusions of his thought will be equally valid. Though the starting point may be correct, it is quite possible that errors of reasoning may occur throughout the process of the thought. Though not all philosophers have been rationalists, all philosophers have resorted to some kind of reasoning process to argue their views. This has been demonstrated in existential philosophy as well as other forms of epistemology. The question of formal truth concerns the question of internal consistency. It involves questions of logic and of statements that can be verified or falsified strictly by reason. For example, if a philosopher began with a statement, all men are mortal, and then added the second premise, namely that Socrates was a man, and reasoned to the conclusion that Socrates was not mortal, the philosopher would be making an obvious blunder. His conclusion would not be valid. It is interesting that in logic textbooks, examples of logical errors are not cited from the lower classes of literature, such as comic books or tabloids or propaganda manuscripts, but from the finest literary products of Western culture. Passages from brilliant thinkers as John Stuart Mill, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Aristotle, Cicero, and others are used as illustrations of examples of blatant logical fallacies present in the works of the most learned men. Thus, a major reason why brilliant men disagree about important issues is because even brilliant men are capable of making mistakes in their reasoning process. When we see experts disagree, we must not assume at the outset that the experts in questions have all been consistently reasonable in their formal argumentation. And by the way, this is important even when we study theology. If you get Calvin, Edwards, Luther, Spurgeon, Sproul in a room, they're not going to agree on everything. And they're not going to be right about everything. Now, they tend to agree, those guys I mentioned, on a lot of things and a lot of theology. But if you start talking about eschatology, end times, and those guys' view on Israel and the church, it's going to be very different. Okay, reasonable, logical, smart, but they're going to disagree. And there's going to be various reasons why they disagree on that issue. Okay?
And
So,
when they disagree, one of them's wrong.
yeah, again, so at least one of them's wrong.
At least one of them.
Yeah, at least one of them's wrong. And they could all be wrong. Okay? But again, they can all be right. Yeah, if there's a disagreement. Okay. All right, then factual or inductive errors. Just as men can err in formal reasoning, so mistakes can creep into our thinking by virtue of errors made in collection of hard data. Descartes, in his day, demonstrated the very real possibility of perception errors made by men. We are aware of the limitations of our sense organs, which cannot grant us total knowledge and accuracy. For example, there are frequencies of sound that are so high that they're not audible under normal circumstances to the human ear. This was made painfully clear to me in an incident from my childhood. Having purchased a new puppy, I went to the hardware store to buy a dog whistle. Upon coming home, I tested the whistle by blowing it, but I heard no sound. I returned to the store, complained that the whistle did not work, and asked for a refund. The store owner carefully explained to me that though I could not hear the sound of the whistle, my young puppy could and would respond. That was my practical introduction to the difference of sensitivity of perceiving sound between the human ear and the ear of a dog. The other senses that we possess are also seen to be less in strength and sensitivity than those of other creatures of our own environment. There are animals whose sense of smell is considerably greater than ours, others whose sense of sight is greater, and so on. We have been able to overcome some of the limitations of our senses by the invention of sophisticated and sensitive machinery of measurement and observation. But even these machines cannot be claimed to offer perfect sense perception. Natural limits will always be involved in the empirical process. We simply cannot assume that things invisible or inaudible to us have no existence. The scientists know better, and they know that there is much that lies beyond the scope of the most technically advanced machines. Not only are we materially vulnerable to the limits of our sensibilities, but we always face the problem of reaching conclusions on the basis of insufficient data. For example, if 100 college students ate a dining hall meal and 30 of those students were immediately affected with intestinal distress, we would seek to find the common denominator in their experience in order to isolate the cause of their sickness. If we discovered that 70 of the students had lemon meringue pie for dessert and the other 30 students had cherry pie for dessert, and that it was the students that had the cherry pie that were sick, we would probably conclude that the cherry pie caused the intestinal problem. Suppose, however, the real cause of the sickness was the fact that the student who served the cherry pie was carrying a highly contagious disease, while a different student served the lemon meringue pie, so that the cause of the illness was not the cherry pie. Rather, the cherry pie was simply the avenue by which these 30 people came into contact with the real cause of the disease. To simply stop at the cherry pie would be to come to a conclusion with insufficient evidence. The problem of empirical error is complicated in the realm of negation of existence. It is obviously easier to verify the existence of something empirically than to negate the existence of something empirically. For example, if one made the assertion that there was gold in Alaska, the verification of that statement could conceivably be done very quickly and very simply. Though unlikely, it is possible that the first spade of earth overturned in Alaska would produce gold. If such a happening took place, the original assertion would be verified. However, to negate the assertion that there is gold in Alaska would involve searching every square inch of that land to finally say with certainty there was no gold in Alaska. Because of this difference in difficulty of verification, many theists have taken comfort that it's virtually impossible to disprove the existence of God by an empirical method. To do so would demand a thorough investigation of every nook and cranny of the entire universe. And even if such a search were possible, it is also true that we may not possess the perceptual abilities necessary to find an invisible transcendent being. The atheist, of course, has pointed out that he is not seeking to deny the existence of God merely on the basis of empirical data, but is arguing that the assertion of the existence of God leaves the burden of proof upon the affirmer rather than upon the denier. Another subtle problem with inductive research and human fallibility was pointed out in the early stages of the LSD controversy. when a wave of protests arose concerning the experiments conducted by Timothy Leary at Harvard University, Leary was charged with the improper use of hallucinogenic drugs. Leary responded to the charges by arguing that LSD was not an hallucinogenic drug, but rather a psychedelic drug. What was Leary's point? His key argument was that a hallucinogenic drug was a drug that affected a distorted view of reality. Hallucinations involve delusions. But claimed Leary, LSD affected not an illusory view of reality, but a heightened ability to perceive reality. LSD was not mind-distorting, but mind-expanding. He cited the testimonies of numerous persons from the artistic world to buttress his claim. Artists told of being more acutely aware of color and texture while under the influence of the drug. Musicians claimed to be able to perceive previously unknown harmonics. People involved in the sexual revolution made claims that LSD so increased tactile sensitivity that users were able to experience orgasms in their elbows. Who was able to refute these claims? The empirical inductive method is haunted by the question of limitations of our sensory organs, the questions of how much the subject imposes on the data he has investigated. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then last, psychological prejudices. We'll end with this. The fourth category of causes for error looms as a constant threat to accurate conclusions. If a man's epistemological system is sound, his deductive reasoning impeccable, and his inductive procedure inerrant, all of this would still not guarantee proper conclusions. By reason of emotional bias, he might still refuse to yield to the obvious conclusions of his research. A classic aphorism of our culture is, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." This tendency to persevere in an opinion against all evidence is humorously illustrated by an anecdote related by the Lutheran theologian John Warwick Montgomery. Once upon a time, note the mystical cast, there was a man who thought he was dead. His concerned wife and friends sent him to the friendly neighborhood psychiatrist. The psychiatrist determined to cure him by convincing him of one fact that contradicted his belief that he was dead. The fact the psychiatrist decided to use was a simple truth that dead men do not bleed. He put his patient to work, reading medical texts, observing autopsies, etc. After weeks of effort, the patient finally said, all right, you've convinced me, dead men do not bleed." Whereupon the psychiatrist stuck him in the arm with a needle, and the blood flowed. The man looked down with a contorted, ashen face and cried, "Good Lord, dead men bleed after all." Oh, I love that. Emotional prejudice is not limited to the dull-witted, the illiterate, and the poorly educated. It is exceedingly difficult for the most brilliant of men to be free of it. Philosophers and theologians are not free from vested interests and psychological prejudice that distort thinking. The purpose of the foregoing survey of error factors is not to build a foundation for despair or provide a basis for resigned skepticism. Though the road to knowledge may be fraught with perils of error, it is a road that must be taken, if we are to think at all. To be aware of the possibility of prejudice, or even if it is clear existence, is not to cure it, but that awareness is a prerequisite for the cause. The question of the existence of God is a question that provokes deep emotional and psychological prejudice. In the arena of theological philosophical debate, the stands are crowded with vested interests. It is precisely this dimension of psychological vested interest that has been the driving force for much speculation concerning the origin of religious belief. So next week, we're going to look primarily at the psychological aspect of this. It really is interesting. If you've ever read the most famous atheists, all of them, all the real famous ones, the one that you guys read in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that I grew up with, the modern the modern atheists don't hold a candle to the older atheists as far as their articulation of argumentation. But one of the things that you find with all of them that they all have in common, every single one of them, they all had a poor relationship with their earthly fathers. And Paul Vitz, V-I-T-Z, has written 3 books. He's a Christian psychiatrist, and he's written 3 books on this whole idea of why is it that such a high percentage of atheists had such a poor relationship with their father, and how that has led them in a journey to basically spend their lives being critical of anybody who believes in God. And, you know, it really is fascinating to me that again, I say this all the time, you hear this all the time, but I don't think it's very much different. It'd be like if I made a living writing books and on the speaking circuit and being interviewed on national television with people on why I don't believe in the Easter Bunny. Okay, why can't I make a living with that? Because it's absolutely absurd.
Really?
People don't believe in the Easter Bunny. But there are billions of people who believe in God. And so the reality is, no matter how many atheists you have, no matter how popular they are, no matter how many books they sell, the amazing thing is they make their living on going against something that supposedly doesn't exist. And I just find that incredibly fascinating. Yeah. I also find it incredibly fascinating that what they all have in common, bar almost none, you don't find a popular atheist that had a good relationship with his earthly father. Yeah. So the psychological reason, as R.C. Sproul's going to, I think his thesis, this book was entitled The Psychology of Atheism when it was first written. That was the title of the book, The Psychology of Atheism. It's become, If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? But when I first read it, I read it in 1979, and he wrote it in 78. It was called The Psychology of Atheism. And what was interesting about it at the time was I was witnessing to 3 friends who all claimed to be atheists, all had a horrible relationship with their father. And I happen to have a great relationship with my father. I mean, my greatest hero in life is my dad. And I can't wait to see him in heaven again. Godly man, loving man, kind man, gracious man, great model, great teacher, great provider for our family. I mean, anything you'd want in a father, that was my dad, that was good. And anything that was bad, I didn't exist. I was very fortunate to have the dad I had. But I think it's interesting that my 3 friends, who, as far as I know, are all still atheists and have gotten more bitter over the years, the contrast between what I grew up with in the home and what they grew up with in the home, and that it led them to a life of basically what they're living for is to disprove the existence of God. One of them's even a philosopher. That's what he's an atheist philosopher. Teaches at interesting enough, he teaches at a Catholic university, but he's an atheist, which is par for the course in our relativistic age.
Right.
But again, it is incredibly fascinating to me that you listen to the arguments, you listen to the defenses, you listen to all that, and I think that at the root of this, at root of why there are atheists, if there's a God, why are the atheists? At root of that is Romans 1 makes it very clear that God has revealed himself so that we are all without excuse. And it's not the intellectual reasons. It's they want to rebel against God. They want to live in sin. That's why there are atheists. And I look at, like, even in, there's a lot of people I love a lot that claim to be, some of them claim to be Christians, and some of them do not make any claim to be Christians, but they are completely not interested in what we're doing here today. They wouldn't be caught dead in church. To them, God is the most boring thing on the planet? Why would I waste my Sunday? Why do people sing to this thing that doesn't even exist? Why is it that one person can, everything, like for me, there's nothing more exciting than God. There's nothing more exhilarating than talking about God, worshiping God, serving God, being with God. God is everything to me. And yet, there are people just like me who are just as passionate about the 49ers or outer space or works of fiction or drugs or sex or whatever. And ultimately what it comes down to is nobody's without excuse, but it's what do you do, what do you feed your beliefs with? Okay? And people are either running away from God or they're running towards God. If they're running towards God, that means that I think God has clearly revealed himself to them. And they get God and they want more of him. But people that are running from God don't get God at all. What they think of when they think of God is nothing like the reality of what God is like. Because if it was, they'd be running to him, not away from him. So again, we'll dive deeper into the psychological stuff next week. And so let me pray for us. And I don't know about you. I love talking about this stuff. To me, this is fun stuff. Yeah.
This idea, because the bad father, okay, the kid is bad, does it start within them, or does it start with the dark forces from outside which feed into them?
It's both. Yeah, it's both. But again, it is interesting that, again, we're going to talk about God our Father today in the service. We're going to talk specifically about the person and the Godhead who is Father. And like it or not, that's the way God the Father has revealed himself in that language.
Yeah. Right.
And what do we have? We have fathers and mothers. We have sons and daughters. So relationships are designed, human relationships are to be designed after the relationships in the Trinity. And as much as feminists want to change that, it's a huge mistake. Because again, what you're doing is you're changing the way God has actually revealed himself with the language that God has used of himself. And that can't be changed. You can change it if you want, but what you're doing is you're messing with objective truth.
Yeah.
As revealed by God. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, I know better than God. Yeah. I want to call God Mother. I want to call God Goddess. Yeah. Right. Well, what you're doing is you've now made your own idol. Right. You've made something in your image. You're not made in their image. You're making something in your image. And again, this is a huge problem today in churches. And colleges and universities and what have you. But again, almost all of this flows from what we've been talking about more than anything else in this session, objective truth. God has revealed himself by what is made and through our conscience such that we are without excuse. Yeah. So when someone says they're an atheist, honestly, they're lying.
Yeah.
They're lying.
To themselves and to you.
Okay, now, they could lie all they want with me, but they're going to have to stand before God one day and try to lie. Yeah. Now, I don't know what they're going to be lying about. They're standing right before God himself. So it's pretty hard to empirically now, with someone that you can see, and say, oh, you don't exist, and oh, you do have scars. Oh, Yeah, no. The reality is, they've known all along. And that's why they're without excuse. So I think, I truly believe the quiet, if you've ever experienced the most quiet you've ever experienced, you haven't experienced anything yet, to when we stand at the judgment day and Richard Dawkins is there with his mouth wide open and Sigmund Freud and on it goes, all these people that thought they were the greatest gift since sliced bread. And they're standing before God, and they have nothing to say. But it's coming. It's coming. And that's why, it's like the evidence is overwhelming. But again, they don't want the evidence. I want to live in sin. I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to be accountable, to this cosmic Santa Claus or whatever. Yeah.
Oh, I was just thinking that the root cause of like atheism, agnostic, and subjective truth and all this is the self.
Mm-hmm.
Not wanting there to be a God. Just wanting it their way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And God doesn't.
It just reminds me of a toddler throwing a tantrum because he doesn't get a toy in the store.
And God doesn't.
We've all
right?
seen that.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, who's this little punk, who's 1 foot tall, and his parents been working their tail off, and he's going, insane because he doesn't get this toy. And that's what atheists are like. It's like God's given them everything, and they're throwing a tantrum because they can't be God. But again, it's just it's the way it is. And again, they need
us to exist.
No. He doesn't need anything. Yeah. All right. Well, let's pray. Father, I just want to thank you for a good discussion, and we thank you for R.C. Sproul's ability to communicate difficult things in simple ways, and he is just so good at that. And so, Lord, I thank you for how we're going through this book, learning new terms and learning just sort of the mindset and the heart and the philosophy and the logic and the subjectivism and the objectivism of those people that we're trying to reach. And I just pray that you give us wisdom and help us to not shy away from asking people to explain themselves and why they believe what they believe. And how can they make such a statement? Where's the backing for it? We can't just let people make false statements that go unchallenged. And we do that all the time. And so, Lord, I pray that you would give us confidence in you and in your truth and in your word, and that you would help us to be compelling articulators of the gospel. That when we speak, we would speak with the authority that you've given us, not because it's our ideas, but it's your ideas. It's what you say. And if you say it, it's true. And it's true for everyone. And so people need you. They need the gospel. They need Jesus. They need to know what you're like. And so, Lord, I pray that as we study these things, you would help us to remember what we need to for when we need it. And most of all, just that it would increase our grounding in the truth, so that when we hear lies, when we see people that are deceived, we are quick to be able to give them good reasons for the hope that we have, according to 1 Peter 3, that we have reasons for our hope. And that because we have these reasons, we're more likely to lead people into the truth. And we just pray that you would give us many opportunities to do that, even this week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.